For 20 long years, a conflict in a small corner of Southeast Asia came to define an entire generation. It left scars on the American psyche that honestly haven't fully healed even today. This was America's longest war at the time, and you could argue it was its most divisive. So let's get into it, the story of how a nation ended up in a war it just couldn't win, and then, for a long time, tried its best to forget. And that really is the question, isn't it? How did this happen? It all started with what seemed like good intentions, Cold War logic, and just a handful of soldiers. But it spiraled into something so much bigger, so much more tragic. Let's break down exactly how we got from point A to point B. The journey into Vietnam wasn't some single dramatic leap. It was more like a series of small, almost unnoticeable steps down a very, very slippery slope. And it all began with one powerful idea. This right here, this was the whole justification. You have to remember, this was the height of the Cold War, this high-stakes chess match between the US and the Soviet Union. American leaders genuinely believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of the region, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, would all collapse just like a row of dominoes. And that was a risk they were not willing to take. And this timeline really shows you that gradual slide. Look at this. We go from just a few hundred advisors in 1955, who were supposedly just there for training, to over 16,000 by 1963. It was this careful fiction, that they weren't combat troops, until they were. In 1965, the first official U.S. combat Marines waded ashore at Da Nang, and the game completely changed. And this is what blew the doors wide open. After a really murky incident in the Gulf of Tonkin involving a U.S. warship, Congress passed this resolution. And what it did, essentially, was hand President Johnson a blank check. It gave him the power to wage a full-scale war without ever having to go to Congress and ask for a formal declaration. The floodgates were now open. So America was now at war, and it brought the greatest, most powerful military machine on the planet to a small nation of jungles and rice paddies. But the way the war was fought, the very nature of the conflict, well, it created a situation that was basically unwinnable from the start. You can see the problem right here. It's a fundamental mismatch. The U.S. military was built for conventional warfare. It was all about overwhelming firepower, advanced technology, and measuring success with things like body counts. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they were fighting a totally different war. They relied on guerrilla tactics, on sheer endurance, and on their incredible knowledge of the terrain. They could just melt into a village or disappear into these massive, complex tunnel systems. And that's the crucial point. On paper, America was winning every single major battle. The kill ratios, as they called them, were always lopsided in their favor. But those statistics were meaningless because they were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy whose entire strategy was just to outlast them. The Vietnamese had time on their side and a will to reunify their country that no amount of bombing was ever going to break. And the scale of the firepower the U.S. brought to bear, it's just staggering. Think about this. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than in all of World War II combined. You had powerful chemicals like napalm and Agent Orange that literally reshaped the landscape. And yet, despite all this overwhelming technological dominance, the enemy's will to fight just remained. For years, the American public was being told the same thing over and over. We're making progress. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Then came January 1968 and the Tet Offensive. It was a single moment that shattered that illusion for good. And this is the great paradox of Tet. From a purely military standpoint, it was a disaster for the communists. They suffered absolutely devastating losses. But that's not what Americans saw on their televisions. What they saw was chaos. They saw their own embassy in Saigon, the very heart of American power, under attack. This enemy they were told was on the verge of collapse suddenly seemed to be everywhere at once. And then you had quotes like this, coming directly from the ground, that just captured the brutal, almost nonsensical logic of the war. This one line, reported back home, probably did more to undermine the war effort than any enemy propaganda ever could have. It just exposed this deep, dark contradiction at the heart of the whole mission. This says it all. When Walter Cronkite, who was, at the time, the most trusted newsman in America, went on the air after Tet and basically declared the war a bloody stalemate, President Johnson knew it was over. The credibility gap, the difference between what the government was saying and what people were seeing with their own eyes, had just become a giant chasm. So, as confidence in the war collapsed, the conflict over in Vietnam ignited a whole new war right here at home. It was a cultural and political battle that really, truly tore the United States apart at the seams. The anti-war movement just exploded. What started out on college campuses grew into this massive nationwide force. You had hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets. Acts like publicly burning your draft card became these incredibly powerful symbols of defiance against a war that millions of young people saw as deeply immoral. But for every single protester, there was a fierce, and I mean fierce, backlash from other Americans. They saw the dissent as a betrayal, an insult to the soldiers who were fighting and dying overseas. The nation just fractured into two angry, opposing camps. You saw those bumper stickers everywhere. America, love it or leave it. It was a bitter, bitter divide. And this was the tragic moment the war truly came home. When President Nixon announced he was expanding the war into neighboring Cambodia, protests erupted everywhere. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed student protesters. They killed 4 of them. The violence that had been happening half a world away had finally bled onto American soil. At this point, the nation was exhausted, it was divided, and the end of America's involvement was pretty much inevitable. But the way it finally ended, the final collapse, it came with a speed that just shocked the entire world. So here's how it happened. First, you get the Paris Peace Accords in '73. This lets America pull out its last troops while claiming they achieved peace with honor. But then, pretty quickly, American aid to South Vietnam just dries up. Seeing their chance, the North launches its final all-out offensive in 1975. And the South Vietnamese army, this force that America had spent 2 decades building and supplying, just melted away. In a matter of weeks, it was all over. 58,220. That is the number of American service members who died in Vietnam. 58,220 names, each one etched into that long black granite wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And then there's this number, an estimated 3 million. 3 million Vietnamese people, soldiers and civilians from both the North and the South lost their lives. It's a staggering human cost for a war fought over their land. The legacy of the war was just profound. For one thing, it was America's first clear military defeat, and it completely shattered this post-World War II myth of American invincibility. But maybe even more importantly, all the years of official misinformation and lies created this deep, lasting distrust between the American people and their leaders that we still feel today. And that really brings us to the final lingering question, doesn't it? Vietnam became a synonym for a quagmire. It was supposed to be this ultimate warning about the limits of American power. The lessons were all there, and they were written in blood. But when you look at the decades since, you have to wonder, were those lessons truly learned? That, I think, remains a very open question.